What if I told you a 14-year-old boy was ripped from his Brooklyn home, accused of a murder he didn't commit, and branded guilty before he even understood what was happening? That boy was John Bunn. And the detective who put him there? Louis Scarcella, a man a New York judge later accused of showing a disregard for rules, law, and the truth. This isn't just John's story. This is how one detective built a playbook of corruption, and how the system let him use it again and again. In the summer of 1991, New York City was a cauldron of fear. Crime rates were high, the headlines screamed blood and chaos, and politicians promised law and order at any cost. So when a corrections officer was gunned down in Brooklyn, pressure exploded. The public demanded answers. The NYPD wanted results. And careers, police, prosecutors, even judges, could be made or broken on this single case. Enter Detective Louis Scarcella. He was known as the closer, the guy who could get a confession when no one else could, the man who could deliver convictions fast. Prosecutors loved him. Reporters wrote glowing profiles. Juries trusted his swagger. But here's the dark truth. Behind that reputation was a pattern of shortcuts and corruption that would unravel lives. And the first domino to fall was a 14-year-old boy. It was early morning. John was at home, just a kid, barely a teenager. His mom was in the kitchen, making pancakes. The sound of basketballs bounced outside. Then came the knock. Not a neighbor, not a friend. A badge, a command, a threat. Step outside. John was yanked from the only world he knew and dragged to a precinct. Handcuffed to a pole. Accused of murdering a corrections officer. Think about that for a second. 14 years old. Accused of a crime that carried decades behind bars. Maybe even life. What would you have done if cops stormed into your home at 14 and told you your life was over? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I guarantee most of us wouldn't survive that interrogation room. This wasn't random. This wasn't sloppy police work. Scarcella had a system. Here's how it worked. Find a witness or create one. Shape the identification. Pressure the suspect until they say what you need. Present the story in court, polished and airtight. The science? Ignored. The doubts? Silenced. The gaps? Papered over with testimony that fit the narrative. This was the corrupt detective's playbook. And John was now the star of a story that had already been written, before the evidence, before the trial, before truth had any chance to breathe. The surviving corrections officer, wounded, traumatized, unsure, was brought into a lineup. He hesitated. He wasn't certain, but under pressure, he pointed at John Bunn. One shaky identification, framed as gospel truth, was enough. To a jury, it sounded like certainty. To the prosecution, it was a win. To John, it was the beginning of a nightmare. But here's what nobody knew then. That lineup wasn't just flawed. It was part of a pattern Scarcella would repeat across case after case, leaving a trail of wrongful convictions that would take decades to uncover. The trial was swift. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the lineup. The jury saw a frightened kid in handcuffs. The defense lacked resources. It was never a fair fight. The gavel came down. Guilty. Just like that, John Bunn's adolescence vanished. From a boy riding bikes and playing ball to a number in the prison system. And yet, the bigger question wasn't just, how could this happen to John? It was, how many more times could this same method be used? Behind the polished story told in court, the cracks were already there. Witnesses would later recant. Lineups would be exposed as suggestive. Evidence was mishandled or simply disappeared. But in 1991, none of that mattered. The system had its conviction. The public had its closure. And Louis Scarcella had another win on his record. Do you think the justice system cares more about truth or about results? Tell me in the comments, because John's story forces us to confront that ugly question. So this act ends with the slam of a gavel. A boy is removed from his life. A community believes it has justice. And a detective's myth grows stronger. But here's the twist. What the public didn't know was that this wasn't just John's story. It was the opening act of a much bigger pattern, a pattern that would stretch across Brooklyn, ensnare dozens of innocent lives, and eventually collapse under the weight of its own corruption. One wrongful conviction is a tragedy. Two start to raise eyebrows. But when case after case shows the same detective, the same tactics, the same red flags, that's no longer coincidence. That's a pattern. And in Brooklyn during the 80s and 90s, that pattern had a name: Detective Louis Scarcella. When John Bunn was locked away, the newspapers quickly moved on. The headlines shifted to the next crime, the next suspect, the next story that satisfied the public's hunger for justice. But prison is where the quiet consequences live. John was sent to Spofford Juvenile Detention. On paper, it was supposed to rehabilitate young offenders. In reality, it was a factory of trauma. You learn fast. Don't look weak. Don't trust easily. Don't talk too much. And most importantly, don't expect anyone outside those walls to fight for you. But inside this bleak reality, John discovered something unexpected. He taught himself to read. At first, it was survival. Books gave him escape. But soon, literacy became a weapon. Words let him frame his own story. He could write letters, file motions, organize memory, fight back against the false narrative the system stamped on him. Guilty, dangerous, irredeemable. And while John quietly rebuilt himself through words, outside those walls, lawyers and journalists began noticing something strange, echoes of his case popping up in other files. By the early 2000s, cracks were forming in Scarcella's myth. Journalists started asking, why do the same witnesses appear in unrelated cases? Why do the same patterns repeat? Anonymous tips, shaky identifications, confessions that don't add up. Lawyers compared notes. Witnesses later admitted they were coached. Lineups were structured in ways that practically guaranteed Scarcella got the ID he wanted. Informants were recycled, testifying in multiple trials. Physical evidence was conveniently lost or destroyed. One wrongful conviction looks like an accident. Dozens. That looks like a playbook. What do you think? At what point does repeated mistake stop being a mistake and start being deliberate corruption? Let me know in the comments. For years, Scarcella was untouchable. He was the hero cop, closing cases others couldn't. His work earned headlines that made him a celebrity detective. But in 2013, something changed. The New York Times published a deep dive into his cases. Reporters documented a disturbing pattern. Eyewitnesses pressured, confessions that looked coerced, convictions that collapsed when re-examined. That article didn't just raise doubts, it opened a floodgate. Suddenly, lawyers, exonerees, and advocacy groups like the Exoneration Initiative started pulling old files. They spotted the same fingerprints, the shortcuts, the omissions, the narratives too tidy to be true. And the myth of Scarcella as a super cop began to unravel. The turning point came not from the press, but from the courts. Judges began reading transcripts, reviewing the evidence, looking closely at the methods used to secure these convictions. And in one ruling, a judge used words that cut deeper than any editorial ever could. A disregard for rules, law, and the truth. Those weren't rhetorical flourishes. Those were judicial findings. Think about that. A court, an institution built to uphold justice, was saying out loud that this detective's work was so flawed, it actively endangered justice itself. That phrase would echo in case after case. And once that language hit the record, prosecutors could no longer pretend everything was fine. But here's the disturbing part. Even as convictions were overturned, Scarcella wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't indicted. He wasn't stripped of his pension. The system that allowed him to operate kept protecting him. This is where the story widens. Because Scarcella wasn't a lone wolf. He wasn't a rogue cop secretly poisoning an otherwise perfect system. He was a product of the system. Prosecutors depended on his cases. Judges deferred to his testimony. The DA's office promoted him as the man who could get the job done. And when an entire system rewards quick convictions instead of careful investigations, shortcuts don't just happen, they become institutionalized. This is why so many of Scarcella's cases look the same. The incentive wasn't truth. The incentive was results. Do you think prosecutors and judges knew what was going on and just ignored it? Or were they blind to it because they wanted to believe the myth? Drop your take in the comments. Behind every overturned conviction was a life shattered. John Bunn wasn't alone. There were men like Derek Hamilton, who spent 21 years behind bars before his conviction was vacated. There were others whose names didn't even make headlines, but whose lives were hollowed out by the same methods. Families destroyed, jobs lost, decades of freedom erased, and all of it resting on manufactured narratives crafted to look like justice. But as the cases piled up, a chilling question emerged. If Scarcella's work was this tainted, how many innocent people were still in prison? While the system wrestled with its guilt, John was living through the long shadow of wrongful imprisonment. He learned to read. Then he began teaching others. He earned his GED. He survived the crushing years, one day at a time. But survival wasn't victory. Every letter he wrote, every legal motion he filed, was fueled by a single determination. I will not let them erase me. And slowly, he began to gather support. Lawyers, journalists, advocates who believed his story deserved another look. That persistence would one day pay off in court. But at this point in the story, John's endurance was just one thread in a much larger tapestry, the unraveling of Scarcella's empire of convictions. By the mid-2010s, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office could no longer ignore the obvious. They launched a conviction integrity unit to review dozens of cases tied to Scarcella. Each file revealed the same disturbing playbook. Witnesses who later admitted they were fed lines. Evidence conveniently lost or destroyed. Identifications that, when re-examined, were full of holes. Case after case collapsed. Convictions were vacated. Settlements followed. Millions in taxpayer dollars paid out to the wrongfully convicted. But through it all, Scarcella remained untouched. Here's what I want to know. Should taxpayers be footing the bill for wrongful convictions? Or should the money come directly from the pensions of detectives and prosecutors who caused the damage? Let's debate that in the comments. So where does that leave us? From John Bunn's wrongful conviction to a flood of cases that revealed a culture of shortcuts and corruption. Judges had spoken. Convictions were overturned. Families were reunited. And that's where another act begins, the reckoning. But the man at the center, Detective Louis Scarcella, was still free, retired, pension intact, smiling in interviews, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. Because when you shine a light on corruption this deep, you don't just expose one man. You expose the entire system that let him thrive. By now, the cracks in Louis Scarcella's legacy were no longer cracks. They were craters. Judges condemned his methods. Lawyers lined up with appeals. The press connected the dots. And standing at the center of this storm was John Bunn, the boy who Scarcella framed, the teenager branded a killer, the man who refused to let prison erase him. This is the act where the truth finally fights back. In 2007, two lawyers, Ron Kuby and Glenn Garber, founded the Exoneration Initiative. Their mission was simple but radical: provide free legal help to prisoners with credible innocence claims. John Bunn's letters reached them, and unlike the endless pile of ignored appeals before, these ones were read and taken seriously. The lawyers dove into his case. What they found was staggering. A 14-year-old accused with no physical evidence. A lineup that broke every rule of fairness. Witness testimony riddled with inconsistencies. And above all, the signature fingerprints of Detective Louis Scarcella. This wasn't justice. This was a textbook frame-up. While lawyers fought in court, journalists started digging. The New York Times, the Daily News, and independent reporters uncovered a pattern. Witnesses who appeared in multiple trials. Jailhouse informants who seemed to always tell detectives exactly what they wanted to hear. And they weren't guessing. They had records, affidavits, interviews with witnesses who admitted they were pressured, coached, even bribed. The myth of Scarcella as a super cop collapsed under the weight of evidence. But myths die hard, especially when institutions depend on them. By 2014, the scandal was too big to ignore. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office announced an unprecedented move. A conviction review unit would re-examine over 50 cases linked to Detective Scarcella. That number alone should make you pause. One detective, 50 lives. Think about what that means. This wasn't an aberration. It was a factory of wrongful convictions. Case after case collapsed. Derek Hamilton, Shabaka Shakur. Dozens of men walked free after decades lost. Each overturned conviction was another nail in the coffin of Scarcella's credibility. And yet, he remained untouched. For John Bunn, the legal process dragged on like a nightmare replay. Appeals, hearings, motions, each one forcing him to relive the original injustice. But in 2018, it finally happened. The exoneration hearing. Imagine the scene. The courtroom filled with reporters. Lawyers stacked with files. John, no longer the terrified boy of 1991, but a grown man who had survived 27 years carrying the label killer. The judge reviewed the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. The coerced identifications, the false testimony, the fingerprints of Scarcella's corruption on every page. And then came the ruling. The words John had waited half his life to hear. This case was built on the testimony of a single witness. That testimony was unreliable. The evidence was tainted, and the detective who built the case displayed a disregard for the truth. With that, the conviction was vacated. John Bunn was officially exonerated. When the ruling hit, John broke down in tears. He told reporters outside the courtroom, "I'm overwhelmed. I'm finally free. Y'all don't understand this fight." And he was right. No one who hasn't lived it can fully understand the weight of being branded guilty when you're innocent. The years lost, the trust destroyed, the constant uphill battle just to prove the truth. But John's tears weren't just grief. They were victory. But here's the twist, and it's the part that should make your blood boil. Despite everything revealed, despite multiple wrongful convictions overturned, despite judges openly condemning his tactics, Louis Scarcella has never been charged with a crime. Not one day in jail. Not one fine. Not even the loss of his pension. He retired comfortably, collecting over $100,000 a year in taxpayer money. Money paid not by the system that enabled him, but by the same public whose trust he betrayed. So let's be clear. While men like John Bunn fought for decades just to breathe free air, Scarcella lived without consequence. That's not justice. That's a system protecting its own. John's exoneration wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. It showed that wrongful convictions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because systems reward results over truth. They happen because prosecutors look the other way. They happen because juries are fed narratives crafted by detectives who value wins over evidence. John's freedom was a victory, but the war for accountability? That fight is still unfinished. So where does this story leave us? With a truth we can't ignore. The same system that caged a 14-year-old boy for decades has still not punished the man who put him there. Louis Scarcella walks free. John Bunn had to fight for every inch of freedom he now has. And that raises the question we end with today. If a detective can frame innocent people, have dozens of convictions overturned, be condemned by judges, and still retire with full benefits, what does that say about the system? This was never just the story of John Bunn. It was the story of Louis Scarcella and the system that protected him. But thanks to the courage of exonerees, the persistence of journalists, and the work of groups like the Exoneration Initiative, the truth has been dragged into the light. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. John Bunn walked out of that courtroom in 2018 officially exonerated. But freedom, for him, wasn't just about clearing his own name. It was about making sure no other 14-year-old boy would ever go through what he did. He launched a nonprofit called A Voice for the Unheard. Its mission? To fight illiteracy in prisons and to give young people the education and hope he was denied. John knew firsthand that when the system strips you of opportunity, it doesn't just steal years, it steals futures. Today, he visits schools, speaks at community events, and works with exonerees across the country. His message is always the same. Don't let the system define you. Find your voice and use it to fight back. Meanwhile, the Brooklyn DA's Conviction Review Unit continues to unravel the web Louis Scarcella spun. More convictions have been overturned. More men have walked free. But the man at the center of it, Scarcella himself, remains untouched, a symbol of a justice system that punishes the powerless and protects the powerful. And that's where this story leaves us. John Bunn chose to turn his pain into purpose. Louis Scarcella chose lies over truth and faced no consequence. So the question is no longer whether corruption exists. The question is, what will we do about it? Because until we demand accountability, until we stop rewarding convictions over truth, and until men like Scarcella are held responsible, there will be more John Bunns. And innocence will remain uncovered, but never protected.